it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off on cages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 42 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of, the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or a follower, or provide one-time support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The websites will be in the description section of this podcast. And this unscripted podcast is brought to you by another cold, so sorry for my voice being a little off again, and the occasional coughing. I think it's better than what it was this time last week, but it's still lingering. So anyway, all new listeners, welcome to this unscripted podcast, and thank you for all returning listeners. I appreciate your support. This is the for new listeners, this unscripted podcast is basically the notes on my main articles during the week, and it's just unscripted. I have some bullet points, and I just talk about some of the thoughts of these articles and kind of what led me to write them. So the two articles, normally there's three, but two this week: Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Part 4. And is NATO as militarily strong as it appears? Normally there's three articles, main articles during the week on Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, but only two due to the holiday. I will probably have to go to this format in the future as well, because there's going to be some changes in my work hours, so I will probably have to cut back to two articles a week, but I will probably try to do something smaller in the midweek like I've done. So I am still working out the issues on that one. Also, if I need to change my format at all, either, that's another question. I talked about that last week, is told that if you post fewer, longer articles, you're more impactful, but shorter articles actually get more views. So trying to make a decision. It seems like I'm cutting down the middle, not the best strategy. Of shorter articles get more views, larger articles, longer articles that are created at a much less frequency are more impactful. So I'm kind of dividing the world right down the two. We're probably not good for either one. So still have to decide, but right now I'm going to stick to my current call it strategy of doing the 2 to 3 articles that are from 1,000 to 15, actually 1,700 words a piece, and then some shorter articles during the week. Also, I do for all again new listeners, I do audio. I do the text files, just basically written copies or written files. I do a video summary on those. Then I do an audio with my own voice. I know you can pull it on the AI voice if you want on the main article that's posted on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. But I also narrate one word for word in my own stumbling, bumbling fashion. So if people do prefer not to have AI and have somebody actually put some Shatner-esque like pauses in the reading, I'm for you over AI. So anyway, so we'll get on to today's first discussion: nuclear warfare policy, Cold War to Today, Part 4. I call this the nuclear series. It is one of the two ongoing series I have. The other one is the West Philippine Sea newsletter, not posted every week. And again, there's no set schedule for the nuclear warfare policy. Part 4 was the first part was an introduction and one on Presidential Directive 18 from Jimmy Carter in 1977, I believe. And then parts 2, 3, and 4 were covering President Carter's ND 59, which is, PD 59 or NSC 59. PD stands for Presidential Directive. NSC, National Security Council Memo 59. They were both the same thing, so it can be called PD 59, Presidential Directive 59, NSC 59, NSC Memo 59. It is all the same, and it was written in 19. Let's see. I actually got a copy from the Carter Presidential Library, and you'll hear the papers shuffling in the background. It was dated on July 25th, 1980, and it's a 6-page memo which added something new strategy in this. So I've talked about this before in the prior weeks. The parts 2 through 4, which was basically parts 1 through 3 of PD 59. It didn't create the idea of a limited nuclear war, but it did add more formalization to it, and it added a new strategy, overall strategy for nuclear or for strategic nuclear forces and theater level nuclear forces, called countervailing, which was actually, I watched a documentary. The guy I can't remember the guy's name. He just basically made it up. And he didn't think it'd make it into the memo, and he was shocked and surprised that it actually made it into the memo, though he doesn't remember if he discussed it first with Defense Secretary Brown, I think was the guy's name. So anyway, countervailing. So what you have is what has existed in strategic nuclear warfare targets. You have 3 strategies. Prior to PD 59, there was 2. One was called counterforce, which is basically using your strategic nuclear weapons against the military, specifically the strategic nuclear capabilities of the Soviet Union. That's going after nuclear storage sites, ICBM sites, SLBM sites if they're in port, bomber airfields, bombers themselves, and I believe they generally consider even theater level nuclear storage sites and missile sites as being on the available target list for strategic nuclear weapons, especially when the number of weapons kept increasing to the point that each side had roughly 25,000 warheads each. The list of targets kept expanding. So the counter force targets increased, but also what was the other ones called counter value. Those are that's basically the population. That's the cities. And it could include some industrial targets, but for the most part, counter value is the people. And that was the backbone of mutually assured destruction, or what's sometimes called nuclear equivalency, was the primary, call it hostage, is attack the cities and the populations. If you don't have the populations, you don't have a country. So those are the 2 prior strategies to PD 59 were counterforce and counter value. And there's subsets within each one of those targets as well. And then it added countervailing. And this was specifically meant for the idea of limited nuclear warfare. And the idea was you are going after what is most important to the Soviet leadership. And it could be all the way down to the lives of the individual Soviet leadership. So you're going after things that help the Soviet leadership stay in power. That could be themselves. That could be the command and control centers that help them direct the military resources of the Soviet Union, including nuclear forces. And it could include nuclear storage sites for theater level nuclear weapons, and military targets, both stationary and mobile military locations. And then also, let's see, command and control, try to think here. And then, primary industries that are considered needed for the short-term defense of the nation. That could be again, ammunition building, and something like into those sorts of things that are required to keep a military going. And those were considered part of countervailing. And the idea was that when they went in and started reviewing the idea prior to countervailing becoming an official policy, they noticed that the Soviet Union, its leadership were building deeper bunkers for its leadership. Now, the U.S. obviously had the same thing, but they were building deeper bunkers. They were making missile silos that could be reloaded quickly. For example, a U.S. nuclear missile silo, ICBM silo, would have to require extensive repair to be reused. And that was not the case in the Soviet Union. They were making reusable nuclear silos. They would store they would store ICBMs, and then they would reload them. And so the idea was that they thought that the Soviet leadership was looking for a way to survive a nuclear war, even a mutually assured destruction type scenario. And so countervailing was meant, the concern was that the Soviet leadership would actually attempt a mutually assured destruction with the idea that they could survive and ride out a something like mutually assured destruction, the counter value attack. Even though you may not have a population, obviously nuclear weapons are not going to wipe out every single person. It will, significantly reduce a population. I don't know the studies right off the top of my head, but I think I remember back in the Cold War days when I grew up in the height of the nuclear demonstrations of the 80s. I know that the worst case scenarios were saying, of course, you had the doom and gloom saying nuclear winter would kill everybody. Generally, it was expected that the worst nuclear attack would only kill about 70 to 75%, only 75% of the population. So there would be population surviving. The idea that the Soviet leadership was considering, at least from the U.S. point of view, is that they were going to think that they could survive a mutually assured destruction and come out of those bunkers, or have these bunkers set up that they could maintain continuity of leadership, and that they could come out and take over their rule their country in something that the general idea was during mutually assured destruction, your nation, even if even your people lived, the continuity of government was gone. There was nothing for government to leave. Basically, all that was needed to maintain a coherent society would be wiped out in a general nuclear war that was noted by mutually assured destruction. It was viewed that the Soviet leadership were looking for a way to survive, and thus they were thinking that if they can survive, that means they would not necessarily be unwilling, that the concern was that the deterrence would be removed, that they would actually think that maybe mutually assured destruction is a legitimate strategy for nuclear war, which was always thought that was the ultimate deterrence, was your country's population is destroyed. So maybe we don't live, but you don't live either. And that looks like the Soviet leadership was trying to find a way that they could actually survive and thus win a nuclear war. And thus the deterrent, or the ultimate deterrent of mutually assured destruction, is gone. And that's what countervailing was meant to do. It was this concern is find out the things the Soviet leadership thought they needed to survive, to stay in power during both a limited nuclear war and a general nuclear war, and take those things away from them where they could not lead a country. The idea was countervailing was to restore the idea of deterrence that was being eliminated by the Soviet leadership. That was the idea around countervailing. Now, obviously, the U.S. had some other views of surviving a nuclear war. We know that obviously there's survival bunkers in West Virginia for leadership. So we know that that the U.S. had a similar view, but the idea was countervailing was to eliminate the idea in the Soviet leadership that they could somehow survive a nuclear war, whether, again, limited or general. So this is what that was meant to be. So now, the part that I'm covering, part 3, was it was actually starting on page 3 of the memo. Now that's a 6-page memo, so I'm going to kind of read some of the areas. It focused primarily on countervailing. And so under targeting categories, it says overall targeting planning appropriate to implement the countervailing strategy will result in a capability to choose to put the major weight of the initial response, which could include first strike, because I covered earlier in the document. Not saying that the U.S. was promoting the idea of a first strike, but they did not take it off the board, whether it was an initial first strike or it was a response to basically a move them or lose them type scenario. So being the initial U.S. response. Okay, I'll read this whole sentence over again because I kind of broke it. I'm sorry. Targeting categories. Overall targeting planning appropriate to implement a countervailing strategy will result in a capability to choose to put the major weight of the initial response on military and control targets. Military targets must be selected for the purpose of destroying enemy forces or their ability to carry out military operations. Strategic and theater nuclear forces should, to the extent feasible, be used in combination with and in support of general purpose forces, conventional, to achieve that objective. Remember that you look at some of this and say, you're going, okay, destroy the enemy forces and the ability to carry out military operations. So that sounds like counter force. But remember, this part of the document, overall target and planning and the implementation of the countervailing strategy, this is a focus on just countervalence. So it talks about military targets must be selected for the purpose of destroying enemy forces or their ability to carry out military operations, and will result in the capability where the major weight of the initial response is on military and control targets. The idea is that they're trying to take away the power of the Soviet leadership, whether actually removing the military threat or the command and control ability, their ability to reach out and communicate with with their military, which is what they assumed is what they have to keep themselves in power. So that was what the idea is that I'm writing in that part is. And it also remembers that the idea of countervailing was to support a combination with and support of general purpose forces. That's conventional forces. So the idea is if a conventional war is going on, let's say a war in NATO, conventional war in Europe, is countervailing, which is the use of strategic nuclear forces, could be used to support of or combination with the general purposes forces to achieve that objective. In this case, maybe you're considered the defense of Western Europe from a Soviet invasion. So this is where the idea when you start discussing is how strategic nuclear weapons can be used to stop or remove the ability of Soviet leadership to command forces. This basically proves that doesn't say it has to happen, but it gives the targeting options available that strategic nuclear forces could be used in pursuit of stopping, for example, a invasion of the West by Warsaw Pact forces. So it goes into more to further into targeting categories. It says, again, I'm reading from the document, so this is a little bit different than I normally do because I'm not reading from bullet points. I'm reading from the actual memo. More specifically, the following categories of military targets with appropriate sub-options for different theaters should be covered in planning to include strategic and theater nuclear forces, including nuclear weapon storage. Remember, these are the targets they're going after strategic and theater level nuclear forces of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, including weapon storage. Remember obviously nuclear weapons for bombs for our aircraft. Also, remember reloadable ICBMs. is to go after those in nuclear storage. This is important. Next part: military command and control, communications, and intelligence capabilities. These are viewed as what is needed by the Soviet leadership to maintain control of their country and their armed forces and to give directions to forthwith. So all other military forces, stationary and mobile. So again, it was going after the power structure, what is to keep the Soviet Union in power. And remember, when you're talking about military forces in a communist society, military forces are not the national military forces. They are the military forces of the party, not of the nation, of the party. Now, what you think is they're one and the same? Well, no, the idea is that the loyalty of the military forces, the Red Army, and then you're talking about in the case of China, the People's Republic of China, the military forces are not there to defend the nation. They're there to defend the party. Sometimes those defense points intersect, and sometimes they're completely different. Another part: industrial facilities which provide immediate support to military operations during wartime. So again, this is going after things that would matter to keep Soviet leadership in place. Now, remember, these targeting options are supposed to be the directives that go to Omaha, which is where the Strategic Air Command was in picking the targets for both pre-planned PSYOP and for some of the things that came earlier in this document about the idea of trying to create not just pre-planned strategies for the nuclear or pre-planned targets based on set scenarios of the PSYOP, a single integrated operational plan, which is the targeting of used to create targeting for strategic nuclear weapons, but also to create ad hoc or targeting strategies that were outside of the pre-plan. That's something that can be planned on a relatively short notice. So the idea is that this first part of providing targets is, again, feeding over to Omaha to the Strategic Air Command. So in addition to the pre-planned options, which is what I stated above, which is going to go to the PSYOP, in addition, pre-planned options capable of relatively prolonged withhold or prompt execution should be provided for attacks on political control systems or on general industrial capacity. Again, being fed into the pre-planned options capable of relatively prolonged withhold. So the idea is that some of these are the ideas that you're creating like immediate one-time response, because again, these are big bombs and a lot of people, it's going to be a lot of collateral damage. But so the idea is that this is like just quick options. It could be what they call a nuclear spasm, which was generally mutually assured destruction. You're basically shooting everything off at once. But this is, again, talking about included, in addition, pre-planned options capable of relatively prolonged withhold or prompt execution. So the idea is that they're thinking about a prolonged nuclear war. So this is not a case of talking about generally the idea of a general nuclear war where you're trying to settle the thing all very quickly. The idea is, and you talked earlier in the document about the idea of having intelligence collection to be able to assess bomb damage assessment to determine if follow-on attacks are needed. This is what they're starting to talk about, the idea of a prolonged nuclear war. Now, prior to this idea of a limited nuclear war, it was often called the nuclear spasm, sometimes called the tripwire. Basically, you shoot everything off. Now they're talking about something that's much more structured. And the idea is if you're doing these types of options, you're just not trying to destroy their enemy or destroy the world. You're trying to win. Now, oftentimes this came up during the Carter administration. The part of this also carried over to the Reagan administration. Was the idea was to end a nuclear, and it says this in the document, end a nuclear war on conditions favorable to the U.S. Now, they try to sit there and say later, they try to backpedal. We didn't mean win, we just mean favorable. That it's more favorable to the U.S., at least to the point that it would be incentivize the Soviets to negotiate an end to the war. And then here it says, there must be extensive and effective coverage in the pre-planned options of all categories. I just named the categories above. Methods of attack on particular targets should be chosen to limit collateral damage to urban areas, general industry, and population targets outside of these categories, consistent with effectively covering the objective target. And there, where appropriate, overall plans should include the option to withhold to limit such collateral damage. So the idea is, again, countervailing is not countervalue. These industrial targets and sometimes military targets are within cities themselves. Cities is where the populations live, and those were the primary targets of countervalue. So the idea is that they're not trying to destroy the population or hurt or eliminate the Soviet population. They are targeting specific areas to try to take away the power structures of the Soviet leadership and not necessarily destroy the population. Obviously, bombs are obviously going to cause collateral damage, but it's stating specifically to avoid collateral damage, which I know in this day of modern warfare and having laser guided or having very smart weapons that are very accurate, and the idea of a nuclear weapon not causing collateral damage when we can't even get smart weapons to completely eliminate collateral damage seems kind of laughable, but I guess we're talking about, call it just, I don't know, call it limits, however you call it, in context. So it's kind of laughable. It's not a laughing matter, I guess, but it's just the idea is that they can use nuclear weapons to be, the idea is not causing or limit collateral damage within themselves when you're talking about radiation exposure and fallout and just the effect of the blast of it. But part of this is that also U.S. weapons, ICBMs, generally had a significantly lower yield than the Soviet ones. And this probably played a big role in it. The idea is having weapons that could attack targets without destroying cities, damage cities, take out and maybe a significant amount of a population. But these weren't city busting weapons. These weren't megaton range weapons. I think the average yield of a Minuteman II and Minuteman III missile or warhead, which again they were MIRV, I think they were in the area of 300 to 450 kilotons. Nagasaki was a mere 20, and we're talking about ones that are 300 to 450. But you're looking at the Soviet, or even when you're looking at the Titan II missiles, you're looking at megaton range size warheads, and it's certainly a lot less to be able to do collateral damage. You're going to create a lot more collateral damage with a 1 megaton or 1.5 or 2 megaton warhead, or even bigger warhead. So countervailing, those types of warheads there are either for taking out large amounts of fields, ICBM fields, or entire airfields. But for the most part, when you're talking about megaton range type warheads, you're talking about hardened targets like the Cheyenne Mountain. But for the most part, you're talking about city busting, which is, again, that is your counter value targets. Okay, so I'm kind of running long on this, but I thought it was interesting to read this. Command and control, communications, and intelligence. Flexibility, again, this is in context of countervailing. Command, control, communications, and intelligence, which is C3I is often the designation. Flexibility and contingency planning and operations will be highly dependent on our U.S. C3I capabilities, including their ability to acquire targets, assess damage, and survive attack. Strategic stability in an area of essential equivalence depends as much on survivability, endurance, and reconstitutability of C3I capabilities as it does on the size and character of strategic arsenals. So this is putting the ideas that that the ability to the U.S. to command, control, and communications, and intelligence to determine assess the damage and of our nuclear attacks onto the Soviet Union was just as important as having a sizable nuclear force. Now, this has to stay relative because remember, this has to stay within the mutually assured destruction document was still a valid policy. Mutually assured destruction relies on nuclear equivalency. So you can't go too far out of bounds as far as mutually assured destruction goes. So this is, again, relative to the idea, but the characters that C3 capabilities, as it does on the ability for endurance, survivability, and reconstitutability of C3A capabilities is as it does on the size and character of strategic arsenals. So the idea is that you could get more bang for the buck if you can assess and maintain command of your nuclear forces. Your strategic nuclear forces are almost as important on the number of weapons that you have. The idea is that if you can, maybe you only have to use one bomb for a target instead of three, because you can have your idea of, you can first off have accuracy, be able to assess the damage, and all of this has to survive attack. Because remember, the U.S. would not be doing a countervalue, countervailing, counterforce attack in a vacuum. Even in a absolute surprise first strike, you're going to take damage in return. First off, the Soviet submarines were almost as invulnerable as U.S. submarines. So you've got that countervalue busting right there. So again, the idea is everything had to be survivable. And if it wasn't, it had to be able to be put back together. And this was important on effectively using the weapons that you have. And then it talks to me a little bit more, and I'm going to write a bit more about NSC 53 and NSC 41 on some of the important interplay of pulling in private industry to help maintain this C3I capability. And then it talks about is a relationship of acquisition policy to employment policy. Our acquisition programs must be evaluated in terms of their support for the employment policy ordered by this directive. The required flexibility, survivability, endurance, and the target destruction capability must be taken into account in developing programs for acquiring nuclear weapon systems and their supporting C3I systems needed to support their countervailing strategy. This is the idea, is that there had to be new weapons programs to be able to support countervailing. Countervailing, again, relied very much on the accuracy of nuclear weapons. This meant that it was going to be an ICBM program and a bomber program. Again, you're talking about the strategic nuclear weapons. That is the triad, the strategic triad, which is strategic bombers, strategic nuclear bombers on one side, ICBMs, land-based ICBMs on another side, and then submarine launched ballistic missiles on the other. Remember, at the time, this was in the time of the period employed, and the idea was this was written in 1980. The idea of weapon systems through 1982. The B-1 bomber had been canceled. The B-1A bomber had been canceled. The current SL submarine launched ballistic missile SLBM force was still relying on the Poseidon SLBM and the later version of Trident 1 that came out in 1983. And then of course you had the B-52 bomber because B-1A had been canceled. So the only things that are able to carry out the countervailing strategy were B-52 bombers. And again, you're talking about accuracy. And you need to be able to limit the collateral damage. That meant that the Titan II ICBM was out because the Titan II carried a 1 megaton plus warhead. It was a mountain buster, a city buster type weapon. So that means that Titan II was out. So all now you all have is B-52, and you have Minuteman II and Minuteman III. So currently that means that the forces available was most likely Minuteman III and B-52 bomber. And again, you're talking about survivability at a time when you have a very sophisticated Soviet defense, air defense network. So you figure that most of countervailing was going to fall on Minuteman III. I say Minuteman III because I don't think Minuteman II was as accurate as Minuteman III. And again, this was countervailing was highly dependent on the ability of nuclear weapons to be accurate. SLBMs at the time, the Poseidon missile and the later Trident 1 did not have the accuracy to be able to do counterforce or countervailing. It could only do countervalue. Basically, your SLBMs were there to hold hostage a country's population because nuclear submarines were basically invulnerable to attack. Oceans are wide, long-range missiles. It wasn't until Trident 2 D4 came out in 1990 that you actually had submarine-launched ballistic missiles that could do something other than counter-value targeting. Okay, and then the implementation talks about is that there will be 2 exercises of the National Command Authority conducted each year to evaluate our capabilities and our employment doctrines, basically seeing how countervailing works. Can you continue study and analysis of means to improve and refine our countervailing strategy of general conflict should be conducted by the Department of Defense. The results of these exercise studies and analysis will provide the base for modification and any further development of employment or acquisition policy. That's talking about new weapons coming online. You could probably eventually look at maybe extreme ranges of Tomahawk cruise missile that would be coming out shortly after countervailing became available. And the report will be rendered to the President at least annually for the employment plans, including but not limited to on the size and capability of the reserve forces and the degree of flexibility available. Remember, reserve forces was an important part of it because they could not just decide to limit, because again, mutually assured destruction was still a legitimate strategy. So you still had to have a reserve force available to continue either, again, we talked about prolonged targeting, but you could not use all your assets to maintain, to invoke a countervailing strategy. You had to have reserve forces in case counterforce was needed, or in the case of countervalue, which you just go full on out general nuclear war. So the reserve force was an important part. Basically, he was stating that you could not, by calling out the need for a reserve force, and he said very specifically, very stridently early on in this document, that a reserve force was to be maintained because not all strategic nuclear assets were going to be assigned to a countervailing strategy. And that included in the PSYOP and in any type of flexible planning strategies. So, and any change or new pre-planned options will be submitted to the President for his review and approval in accordance with the current procedures. This document supersedes NSDM 242, which is basically the nuclear doctrine of the Nixon administration that was effective all the way to the supersession of NPD 59, which was in July 1980. So NSDM 242 was signed in 1974 and was not superseded until 1980, and then signed by Jimmy Carter, President of the United States. Now, a couple things is when I started writing this document this series, the idea of limited nuclear war, and it was in the background is President Putin of Russia had talked about he changed the nuclear policy of Russia, and he did it in a relatively short period of time. It took, and just what I read in this document, it took 6 years to update the U.S. nuclear policy. Jimmy Carter started the process in 1977 and did not come up with a working document to replace NSDM 242 from 1974, 6 years after this document was created, to update American nuclear strategy. Now, the Russians might have cut some corners. Maybe my argument is they've always had that decision was in the back of their mind, and not made public, that they had a nuclear flexibility option to attack targets based on not necessarily being. The idea is I think President Putin's he's made several updates, but one of them was he could attack any country that attacked Russia, even if they did not use nuclear weapons. Basically, he replaced the first use policy. And a lot of this goes into he's talking about flexibility of picking. So before, he doesn't have to cite out, okay, well, all these countries are not nuclear, so there's no nuclear options available to him. Now he's left it open that he can attack anybody. So again, we're talking about so much in this document. And again, this is older technology. I get it. That was used in 1977, 1980. But all these the staff, the planning, the targeting, all this had to be written out and it all had to be created. So I don't see how the Soviet Union, the Russia under Putin can change the complete Soviet or Russian document in just a matter of a few short months or a few weeks. So either he already had it changed and just made it public about Russian nuclear policy and targeting, or it's a bluff. That's my belief is you cannot change something as complex as nuclear targeting. Now, I get it. When President Carter wrote this, we're talking about an area of the U.S. having about 25,000 nuclear warheads. Russia only has about, just under 5,000, I think. And limited to a certain, 1,000 ICBMs or strategic nuclear weapons, which I think includes submarines. I have to go back and look. But they don't have to worry about 25,000. But if you're talking about the flexibility of targeting, it's not necessarily the number of weapons, it's the number of targets. So if he's going to create that you can attack targets based on coming from conventional forces, it's still work. It's still staff work. Still have to pick. And actually, the targets become greater and greater because now you left the myriad of countries that are non-nuclear powers that maybe attack you or threaten your country that you can respond with a nuclear weapon, as the President Putin stated. I have doubts. I have either doubts that they have this fully implemented, they will be acting a lot on the fly, or it was nuclear doctrine and they're just making it public. My belief is that it's a bluff. Now, maybe they're in the process of creating such a nuclear document. This is the direction. Yeah, I find that very easy to believe. But to sit there and name it, come out with something in the name of a press conference, I am doubtful. So, but I'll leave it up to you. I don't have any information on that. That's just my gut feeling. Going in there and seeing how complex it is for a strategic nuclear doctrine to be updated in the United States. The Russians were not, or Soviets and the Russians were not careless about their maintaining their nuclear weapons. Maybe not as protective as the U.S., but they didn't have any accidental launches or anything like that in the Soviet Union. So obviously they have protections on board. So again, that was kind of something I put in the background of. It took this long to update the U.S. doctrine. Did the Soviets really, or did the Russians really change theirs in the time of a press conference? Again, I have my doubts. Actually, I finished writing this document or this paper on the day that Jimmy Carter died. He was 100 years old. I hope he rests in peace, and condolences to the Carter family. I don't have a lot of positive things to say about the Carter administration, but I could not say much about his intelligence. He writes this document, makes it sound very warlike, but Jimmy Carter was very indecisive when it came to options of using military force. Many Cold War presidents were like that. They didn't want to threaten start a general nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Can't really blame them. Carter basically just signaled that was his absolute last option. That's probably why the Iranians took such advantage of him. But anyway, just a interesting note about that. That I did finish the paper on the day he passed away, and despite my criticisms again of President Carter, a very interesting person, took a thorough approach on things, but his execution was I think very poor. But I have to say, heartfelt condolences to President Carter and his family. He is going to be buried in Plains, Georgia. So he's not going to Arlington or anything like that. He's going to be buried next to his wife of 77 years in Plains, Georgia. So that is it on PD 59. I will be writing more about things around PD 59 and some of the other documents, but that is the last I will write. It was a 3-part series just on that 5-page memo. I called it 6 pages because there's actually a front cover page, in my view, from Zbigniew Brzezinski, Mika Brzezinski's father. You know her from Morning Joe. So it's a subject, MBB luncheon item targeting, and it's signed by Harold Colonel William E. Odom, and it says ZB. If Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense, does not raise this subject, my sense is that you should not. Brown should take the lead on this. Signed or initialed W.O., William Odom. That's actually in my copy. So he actually handwritten the document with his discussions Brzezinski's discussion with Secretary of Defense Brown. All right, so enough on that one. So is NATO as military strong as it appears? So NATO was created in 1942. 1942, gosh. All right, I'm sorry. 1949. April 1949, the Washington Treaty. It was consisted of 12 countries, 10 European, 2 in North America, which was the United States and Canada, and then 12 countries which were in Western Europe and Northern Europe, and actually I think Italy too was in Southern Europe. So it was signed in 1949 by 12 countries. That again, World War II had just ended, not too long in the distance past. 1948 was a fair amount of tensions in Europe. The famous thought of the Iron Curtain coming across Central Europe, splitting east from west, was becoming commonplace. 1949, you see the Russians detonated their first nuclear weapon, ending the nuclear monopoly of the United States. The Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade, where Stalin tried to power play the Western democracies out of Berlin. It failed, but this is where many of the called the fear of each other between the East and West of the intentions. 1948, the Marshall Plan was put into effect. The Soviet bloc all turned it down under pressure of the Soviet Union. It went just to the Western countries. And the idea is the Marshall Plan was looking at the concern is the post-war Europe and its recovery from the war, which again devastated Europe. And it did Asia as well, but this one's focusing North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We're talking about Europe. It devastated Europe. And the recovery of the nations were faltering. And so concern was, especially when you have a large Soviet army, which was not demobilizing near as quickly as you saw Western armies going, So the concern was that if the post-war recovery doesn't pick up pace, it will destabilize society, which communists can take advantage of by sowing discontent or actually starting revolution. So there was a lot of fear when it was created. So NATO was formed in 1949, 12 countries. And again, I talk about that threat. Talk about the nuclear weapon tests in 1949, the Marshall Plan in 48, and the concerns that were based around that. 1950 to 53, you had the Korean War. The fear of Soviet aggression, of communist aggression, was preeminent. And so you have many of these countries, 12 countries, viewed the Soviet Union as the threat, and they viewed it as an existential threat. So the idea is Article 5 was a guarantee, attack on one was an attack on all, and that the collective defense was the primary basis of the agreement. That was considered the strength, the heart of NATO. That is what made collective defense work. That was the deterrent effect of NATO. And they say, they self-congratulate themselves as, hey, it must have worked because the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact never attacked. So, as NATO did expand a couple times during the Cold War, and that's when you see countries like Turkey becoming a member. And so it did expand, but it was relatively stable. And it was, again, all based on the idea is that the Soviet Union was the clear threat. And the idea is that if the Soviet Union crossed that inter-German border, or if it did something in the Persian Gulf, because I just talked about Jimmy Carter, the Carter Doctrine comes into effect. Yes, the Soviet Union was the clear and dangerous threat. They had 25,000 nuclear weapons towards the end of the Cold War. They had a large army in the East, and they were the antagonists of the West. And the West had a way of antagonizing the Soviet Union. Again, I'm always on the side of us versus the Soviet Union. I'm on our side, so I have my own perception of it, but I know that there was some dual antagonism going on in the Cold War, and so. But again, the idea is that, hey, we knew what the world knew what the threat was, and if they were attacked, it was expected that there was going to be no question that those countries would perceive the enemy, and they would all act in accordance because their survivability depended on it. They had to act together. Well, the Cold War is over, and so NATO found itself without a purpose. And I wrote about this several other times. So NATO started expanding later on into the Eastern European parts, these former Warsaw Pact nations. And became where NATO was no longer about collective defense. It was about security. The idea is that the Russians, because they replaced for the most part the Soviet Union, not all of it, but most of it, NATO was a way to provide security. It provided security from the fear of the return of the Russians into their internal politics. So NATO went from collective defense to providing security, and that's the justification that many of these countries viewed when they joined NATO, and NATO was willing to expand. Because remember, NATO didn't really have a purpose after the fall of the Soviet Union because collective defense would work because there's nothing at that time to defend against. So, and the ideas, again, they went from, in my simple terms, went from collective defense to security. So, they expanded to what is now 32 nations. The last two nations, Sweden and Finland, joined, and it goes all the way almost up to the Russian border. In fact, with Finland, you have a line along the Russian border itself. So NATO at this point is 32 nations large. So it seems like when you look at it, it's like, okay, well, going from 12 nations to 32 nations, NATO is probably the strongest it's ever been. You could sit there and say militarily and military potential wise. Then you go into economic factors because, again, economics is what drives paying off those militaries, the industrial capacity of those 32 nations. NATO by far is stronger than it ever has been on paper. Its military potential is quantitatively larger than the Russians by far. Doesn't even match. I think outside you remove the Russian nuclear weapons, but then again you go to NATO. There's the U.S. nuclear weapons on top of the French and the British nuclear weapons. So the question is, though, when you go into Article 5 implementation, is just like any major part of NATO, any type of decision has to be, you have to have unanimous consent. And it applies to Article 5 as well. So you go in there, and so if you look at the Article 5, it's like, okay, you have to have unanimous consent. But when they had the 12 countries, they realized that, okay, you're not going to get 12 countries to commit armed forces for various reasons. But you could commit forces in defense of that country. You could provide military aid and assistance and not provide direct use of your own armed forces. Or you could go as far as commit sanctions against an armed force. That still holds true for a 32 nation bloc. They do not have to provide, those 32 nations do not have to provide armed assistance to any country that is attacked. They don't have to do it. They have the option of doing, if they vote for Article 5, they have the option to go and say, no, we want to just give, we'll vote for Article 5, but we're only going to do sanctions. Or we're only going to provide military assistance. We'll provide ammunition or tanks or something like that. So all of a sudden that 32 nation bloc is, you don't have 32 nations. Maybe you have 4 of the 32 agreed to provide direct forces. You had 2 provide arms and ammunition, and then you have the other remaining countries just doing sanctions. All of a sudden, that military force does not look that great. So it's not that significant when you look at it. So the 32 nation strength is the top end potential. That is just potential strength. That is not actual strength within an Article 5 calling. The chances of getting 32 nations to agree to send armed forces is so remote, it's even hard to say it with a straight face. So you go into these, and you can't. I mean, Luxembourg only has 1,000 active duty troops. Iceland doesn't have any troops at all. And then you go into the other part of it is, okay, that's if you can get 32 countries to agree to Article 5, but to give that Article 5, which has only been called up once, and it took 6 weeks to make a decision on it. So Article 5 comes, like countries attacked. I gave some examples in the paper. Countries attacked. Article 5 discussion goes into effect. Now, it could go into a case is that, okay, it is agreed that Russia is the biggest threat to European security as far as physical security, removing the idea of Chinese nuclear weapons. So basically you think is in the neighborhood of Europe, by far, without a doubt, Russia is the biggest threat to Europe. So you go in there and you look at the countries of Eastern Europe that are NATO countries. Remember, a lot of these signed 2 things. Is to become a member of NATO, you have to have an elected officials. You have to have elections. You have to hold democratically certifiable elections. Well, maybe the leadership and the legislatures that agreed to join NATO, maybe they're all gone now. Maybe the whole point of view has changed since then. That's one thing. So you can have a change of approach that, yeah, maybe you join and you say, yep, I want to be part of NATO. But then, 20 years later, the leadership's completely changed. People got a different attitude. People that remember the Cold War don't remember it anymore. And maybe you looked at the Russia used to be the traditional protector of the Slavs in Eastern Europe. There's going to still be some affinity to Europe, and maybe they joined for security because they didn't want the Russians to return, but they don't really see Russia nowadays as a threat, or maybe they never did. So you go into countries like Slovak Republic, Hungary, Turkey, they don't see Russia necessarily as a threat. Or maybe they see Russia as a threat, but they have a different way of engaging outside of military force. So I wrote for an example, and the example is, let's say Romania is attacked by the Russians in the Black Sea. And okay, Article 5 discussion comes in there. And so they have a debate, and then Turkey says, no, I don't want a wider war. I think we should just negotiate with Russia, try to negotiate an end, and let's not. So I won't support Article 5. Turkey won't support Article 5, and we'll find an alternate to negotiate an end to the war. All right. That means, again, unanimous consent in Article 5. It just takes one country to do that. And it's not anything illegal. That in this example, Turkey's not doing anything wrong because this is written into the bylaws of NATO. So you can't sit there and say they're doing something wrong and they're not thinking about it. This is the right of any country within NATO to use that inherent veto because all decisions have to be unanimous, including invocation of Article 5. So collective defense in itself is subject to unanimous consent. And so getting 32 countries to agree, you're talking about countries stretching from Canada all the way to Asia and Turkey. And you're going to expect that all these have different views on it. And remember, many of these countries have a traditional affinity to the Russians. Hungary, for their part, is they do have an affinity to Russia, but they have generally kept a friendly relationship. They joined NATO, again, for security because they didn't want the return of Russian troops to their country and reduce their sovereignty or end their sovereignty. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily enemies of Russia. So they might look at a threat completely different. And you run into the same thing in the Western Pacific with for example, the ASEAN countries. You have some that are very anti-China, and then you got some that are pro-China, and then you got some that are in between. It's like, yeah, there's a conflict, but we don't need to, any military aggression needs to be addressed through political negotiations. You've got the same thing going on with NATO and with those 32 countries. The idea is that you can get alignment of 32 countries to agree on anything. It just doesn't seem possible. And what even makes it even worse, for example, let's say, I gave another example. Let's say Finland is invaded by Russia. Again, these are all hypotheticals. Romania won the hypothetical, Turkey vetoing. It's not meant as anything towards any of those countries. It's just a theoretical exercise. Don't read into me picking countries. But, for example, Finland is attacked by the Russians. Well, Finland's defense strategy, one of the things that when they joined NATO is Sweden and Finland looked at, they needed to join together. And when you look at the map of it, is Finland is a relatively narrow country. They do have a lot of force. They do have a lot of lakes, and they have a lot of highly defensive land, but they don't have a lot of defensive depth. Defensive depth plays a role when you're trying to blunt armored warfare. The Russians are big into armored warfare. Maybe not so much after Ukraine, but they're big into it. Always big, and they've always had lots of tanks in the Soviet Union. So part of Finland's defense is defensive depth, and that means they have to rely on Sweden to be able to provide them some maneuver room, not necessarily have Sweden fighting for them, but Sweden gives them geographic depth to keep on into the fight. That might also include predisposition of equipment or rapid predisposition equipment into Sweden from Finland. Again, gives it geographic depth. But let's say Sweden says, no, we veto Article 5. All of a sudden, the defense strategy of Finland is completely compromised because Sweden decides not to support Article 5. And that means that these NATO plans of using Sweden for defensive depth for Finland are completely thrown out. I will use the same example right now. Germany is working on, with NATO and the European Union, to be able to pass up to 800,000 troops through Germany to the east. So basically the flow of troops from west to east. They are creating a large traffic program, reinforcing roads, reinforcing rail lines, being able to create stoppage points, being able to clear for the missile attacks will be expected to go after bridges. They're building a whole infrastructure of how to move troops during an active war from west to east. For example, moving French troops from France to Ukraine. That's part of the deployment process. Well, let's just say Poland, because Ukraine's not part of NATO and will not be, because you can't get 32 nations to agree on anything. So, and I've already kind of said some things about Ukraine being a member of NATO and bad ideas and, not practical at this time. But part of it is also trying to get 32 nations to agree on it, that it's not going to happen. So they need to offer something other than NATO membership to Ukraine, even though that identifies as NATO provides security, not necessarily collective defense, as I stated earlier. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I'm sorry. So Germany, let's say Poland gets attacked by Belarus, and Germany says, no, we reject Article 5, not going to happen. But France does support it, and they want to send troops to Poland. But Germany says no. So Germany's not going to allow any passage of French troops through Germany to help Poland in this attack against Belarus. Germany is having signed work with the European Union and NATO to create this transportation plan. Well, all of a sudden that transportation plan is completely invalid because Germany chose not to support Article 5. Again, all theoretical. This is not pointing at anything, but this goes into the discussion of having 32 individual nations with different perspectives, different national objectives. Even the leadership that originally agreed to NATO is not there anymore. All of these things go into effect, and the more diverse and the more numbers you add, the more likelihood that you're going to get political alignment becomes less and less possible. Especially, again, it's not majority opinion for NATO decisions, it's unanimous decision. So by adding more and more nations, you are actually weakening the potential of NATO. Yes, you become economically, militarily, potential goes up significantly as you add these countries. But the ability to act decisively actually decreases significantly as you add more and more nations. So NATO expansion made it militarily stronger, but made the alliance politically weaker. And these are one of the things is that all Russia needs to do, and maybe China for a certain perspective, is keep at least one NATO country friendly to you, and you can stop any unanimous consent from NATO. The more countries that Russia has friendly to it, the better it could be, which means that could be a moderating factor in Russian policies, is not to piss off friends that you might have in NATO. But, that could be a moderating effect on Russian foreign policy. And again, it's not that they're doing anything wrong. These NATO countries that may be somewhat amicable towards Russia, they are not doing anything wrong because they're acting within the rules that NATO has laid out, which is the crux of how weak this idea of having unanimous consent for any major decision, and the European Union does the same thing, is nearly impossible. So you're going to come up with, even if you come up with all the agreements, everybody agrees to Article 5. I can guarantee that it will be so watered down, it will be less um, powerful than what the actual potential of NATO is. So when you go in there and put NATO strength, and I'll say, hey, look what it is, that is the absolute top end strength that NATO can provide. That is not what will actually go into practice, because if you can get everybody to agree, you're not going to get everybody to agree to the use of force. It's just not going to happen, because everybody views the threat differently. I'll go into Portugal. For example, I don't think Portugal and Belgium, for the same reason, haven't fought any type of war since their colonial wars, which I think ended in the 1970s. And those weren't even full-on wars. Those were just, call them colonization wars. Well, let's say Portugal goes, and let's say we'll go into the idea is that Belarus attacks Poland. Portugal might say, okay, I'll sign on to Article 5, but I'm not doing anything about it. Portugal's out, Spain's out, France is out. So you go in there is, the idea is if you can even get everybody to agree, doesn't mean that you're going to get the military effort into it. I can guarantee that many of those countries are only going to opt for the minimal amount of resistance possible, because they are so diverse in their opinion. Those 32 countries is they're not going to agree to anything. And then you go into the whole thing. It's like, well, why is that possible? How many times did Europe fight wars with each other? And somehow you're going to just force 32 countries to give and say, hey, in the last 75 years of existence, and even water it down further, go to say the last 35 years is, yeah, we all agree on everything. It's like, okay, we're going to just completely ignore hundreds of years of European impulses to not necessarily, if they didn't fight each other, they certainly distrusted each other, and that somehow they're going to universally agree on any type of approach, on any type of threat, consider Russian, is kind of laughable. And okay, that maybe you can get the big countries of Europe or NATO to cajole some of these smaller countries to agree to Article 5. You're still not going to get them to agree to the military force aspect of it. Again, they will do the minimum amount required if they do not see it in their national interest. So, again, this is my kind of whole thing, is that NATO is the bigger countries it gets, the more unwieldy and the more, lack of a better word, the more impotent it becomes. If NATO, it wants to be a military alliance that is more, I don't want to say reactive, but more significant than what you have in today's 32 nation fragmentation. Maybe some NATO countries need to form their own military alliance, not to counter NATO, not to go against NATO. They could be part of NATO and some other organization, because the U.S. does the same thing. It used to be like when you looked at CETO, Great Britain, I think, and maybe France was involved in that one as well. NATO doesn't say that you just because you join NATO doesn't mean that you can't go into any other military alliance. Maybe there's NATO, and maybe there's some other smaller core military organization that can act as a true deterrent in Europe. And I don't know what that could look like. Maybe it's even regional. Maybe it's the Baltic countries form their own type of collective defense where it's outside of NATO, but they're still NATO countries. I don't know. But the idea is that maybe if NATO wants to if you're going to commit to the idea of collective defense and you want it to have real teeth, you're probably going to need a smaller organization that can act, that is made up of countries that view threats and responses in a more aligned thought process. It's just a thought. So there's going to be more on this. Obviously, I've visited this. This is the second time I visited. Kind of a different approach to it, and I do talk about that NATO is basically a Clausewitzian model. Is that politics or war is politics through another means? That's basically how most of the NATO democracies approach warfare, is in that Clausewitzian model. So I did talk a little bit about that, just a consideration. So those are the two articles this week. And really, I think if I had to walk away from it is because of Article 5's response options and NATO's unanimous consent requirements, NATO is not as strong as it appears. And in some places, it might be considerably weaker than what it is. And if it's considerably weaker, is it really that much of a deterrence to Russia? Because when you look at papers saying, oh, look how much bigger NATO is economically, militarily, population-wise, it can wipe the floor with Russia. And that's not the case, because you will never get those 32 countries to align and to bring that full military potential to bear against Russia. You only have a fraction of it to face against Russia. All right, so that's it. There will be other nuclear warfare policies. I'm starting to work on a part 5. It will be outside of NSC 59, PD 59. Again, I want to add there will be several events over the next parts of January for President Carter's burial. Just remember, when I did PD 59, that was all about President Carter's changes to U.S. nuclear doctrine and adding a new strategy and basically codifying more parts of a limited nuclear war. So that's it for this week. I hope everybody had a happy new year. And I will talk to you next week. I look forward to my articles. Drop me lines or comments. I sometimes when I comments, I will actually write fairly significant responses back to any true comments. And I got to say about Substack is that you get actual comments where people actually want to hear opinions or provide their opinions as well. And it's not just a bunch of people sitting on the fence just yelling. You actually get some really good conversations on Substack, something I definitely appreciate. So I thank everybody for listening. If you would like to become a paid supporter, or if you don't want to be a paid supporter, you can go to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi to make a donation. That will be helpful. I am a low overhead operation, but I do have expenses because some of these places that I pull documentation for cost money. So anything that you can do to help out would be greatly appreciated. But there will always be free content always. So if I get enough paid subscribers, I do eventually want to add something in it to provide paid supporters something. But until then, I will continue to provide free content. I will continue to respond to comments. But if you could find it to provide any type of support, financial support, that will be greatly appreciated. If not, just continue to recommend me to friends and people that might be interested in my comment. I hate to sit there and say it's a numbers game, but I also do some research and consulting type work. I won't say consulting, that seems a little too much. Reference work, provide opinions, provide documentations, and reference materials, and my we'll call it educated opinion on things for other writers, and it is paid work. So sometimes numbers help with that as well, because unfortunately numbers show legitimacy. So it seems like it shouldn't be a numbers game, but it is a numbers game, because they will view somebody that has 15,000 followers very much differently than somebody that has 354. So that is just Again, any support you can get, whether it's even, again, recommending more friends and followers or friends to follow or become subscribers would be a great help. So anyway, I hope all of you had a happy new year. And now it's on to the winter time with the holidays being over. So, we will continue on through the winter. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your weekend. And we'll talk to you next week.